Hello, I'm Giles Whittell. We're recording this episode in front of an audience in our newsroom from Tortoise. Welcome to the news meeting.
But never would you think that you would see the Key Bridge tumble down like that. It looked like something out of an action movie.
A bridge in the city of Baltimore has entirely collapsed after being hit by a container ship.
Shares in Donald Trump's social media company have soared, giving the firm a market value of more than $9 billion.
The United Nations Secretary has visited the Rafah border crossing and has made a renewed call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
The courts recognize that Julian is exposed to a flagrant denial of his freedom of expression rights and that he remains exposed to the death penalty.
I'm sure we'll get to talk about some of them. To help us make sense of the news and what should be leading it, I'm joined on stage by Tortoise's political editor, Cat Neilan.
Hello.
And Tortoise's reporter Stephen Amstrong is also here.
Hello.
And we are thrilled to welcome the author, journalist, podcaster, general celebrity preceded by a bow wave of her own renown, Elizabeth Day.
Hello, and thank you, I think.
No, bow waves are just sort of front of mind because of that boat.
You're comparing me to a container ship. It's not starting well.
Elizabeth, you are, of course, the author of your new book, or at least the paperback is new, Friendaholic, and I think of myself as a resident friendless curmudgeon here, so I'm looking for tips. It's out in paperback now. We're going to talk about that properly a bit later. But first, the stories. You've each chosen one. We're going to discuss them in turn, and then at the end, I'll decide what should lead the news. Let's start with long story short. This is where you give us your headline and Kat makes them all cryptic, so I don't expect to understand her. But, Kat...
Mine is actually not that cryptic this time.
Go on then.
Mine is how we fell out of love with the NHS.
Not at all cryptic, rather sad. Thanks very much. Elizabeth.
Well, I have to give credit to Kat for this because she came up with it, and mine is deep fakes to deep stakes. Yes.
I'm not sure if this is within the ethos of the show that you sort of pay such fulsome credit to your competitors. Stephen?
Maintaining my losing streak.
Well,
we'll see.
I became unduly cryptic because of Kat, and now I realise that she's gone full tilt on the NHS, so I'm going to have to revise mine. Let's say it's faith-based political finance.
Faith-based political finance. I anticipate some trolling of libtards. Right. Kat, you're going to go first. Tell us about your story and why you think it matters.
So my story is based on the latest British social attitudes research that came out this week, which show that we have effectively fallen out of love with the NHS. And I, whilst I was reading this, was thinking about, kind of 12 years ago, how the NHS was kind of the centrepiece of the Olympics opening ceremony. And I recently went to see the play Nye at the National Theatre, which is all about the founding of the NHS by Aneurin Bevan. And this kind of general perception that the NHS is sort of so off limits that you can't even talk about what changes it might need without people sort of getting very concerned that it involves in some way dismantling the NHS. But this is all the kind of backdrop to what is actually the case. And according to this research out this week, just 24% of people across England, Scotland and Wales are satisfied with the NHS. That is the lowest figure since records began in 1983. But it's been in decline for a while. So just before COVID, it was 29%, and in 2010, it was 46%. Now, 2010, for people that might not remember that far back, was the start of the Conservative government. It was also the start of austerity, and it was perhaps the start of sort of a real terms cut in NHS budget. So if we look over the spending, if you ignore COVID, because of course they did have to sort of spend quite a lot to kind of deal with those particular issues, NHS spending peaked at in 2009 at 8.1% of GDP and reached its lowest between 2016 and 2018, 7.7%. But that said, we are still spending more. So although it's going down as a proportion of GDP, and inflation is having an impact as well. We are spending more, and that is obviously a kind of a symptom of the sort of problems that we're having with kind of demographics. There is an issue around waste. There is a lot of other things going on as well at the minute, with the strikes and so on, which kind of have been exacerbating waiting times. But the sort of, if you kind of drill down to what people are actually saying, they still very much believe in the NHS as an institution. I've lost my notes. So 91% of people still believe that it should be free of charge when people need it, and 82% said it should be funded primarily from taxation available to everyone, regardless of income. So the sort of fundamentals are still there. We still believe in the NHS as this kind of amazing, incredible thing that many countries don't have access to. But the realities of what we are dealing with, both in terms of the sort of trimming of spend and the changing in demographics, mean that something has got to give.
I like Falling Out of Love as a headline. It's grabby, but how do you support that particular element of the story? I mean, people are dissatisfied with their experience. And are they willing, therefore, to consider a different relationship? I mean,
I think it's the opposite of the sort of Ratner's moment, right? Of kind of you kind of lose your reputation immediately by trashing something, by saying something very stupid, right? The NHS has such a kind of integral part in people's minds and hearts that even if their experience is increasingly bad, they are very reluctant to say it's the NHS's fault. And of course, we can look and see that it's not the NHS's fault. If people have accessed, the NHS services recently, they will, in general, speak very highly of the nurses or doctors or whoever it is that they come into contact with. It is a sense that things are sort of crumbling, in some cases quite literally, because we haven't had the capital expenditure go into physical buildings, or we haven't invested enough in the staff. The sort of nurses and doctors are kind of burnt out after working so hard throughout the pandemic that a lot of people are quitting.
But is there any evidence that people are willing to consider a different funding model? Not surprisingly, it's 91%, isn't it, you said? They like not having to pay at the point of need. That's understandable.
Yeah.
But is there any indication that they're willing to consider a different funding model like in Europe?
Well, the public might not be quite there yet, but it is a conversation that has been taking place for probably at least a decade. I mean, I certainly remember writing about it a long, long time ago. The sort of, particularly when it comes to social care, this idea that perhaps the German model of a sort of insurance base is a better approach. And I know that there are some people in the NHS who think that that is ultimately the direction of travel, or perhaps to sort of charge a sort of minimal amount for a GP appointment, just to sort of ensure that people turn up, first of all, but also to kind of keep things ticking over. There is a sense that perhaps some things might change. I'm not sure that anyone in the political sphere is talking about that quite yet, because of, as discussed, this kind of fear that reform is such a scary idea for a lot of people, because it does, to some people, kind of entail privatisation through the back door.
Yeah.
But the fact that we are, Labour has been talking about reform very openly. Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, does talk about how the NHS does need to be reformed in order to sort of keep it going for the 21st century. There is a recognition that there will be some changes to the health service, whether it is more about how the health service operates rather than how it is funded. That might be the sort of initial version of that reform.
OK. Elizabeth, how's your friendship with the NHS?
It's one of those friendships that's going through a tricky phase, but I hold out hope for the future. And I say that as someone who is the daughter of a now retired surgeon who spent many years working for the NHS. And his point was always that the issue is not just severe underfunding, but it's also how we apportion the funds and who makes those decisions. And so often, it's not the doctors and the nurses and the people who are actually making the NHS work and giving life-changing, life-saving treatment. It's a managerial class who don't really understand how things in hospitals should operate. And I think that's still an issue, that there's the management class and then there's the politicians, and there's no stability with the health secretaries that we have because of our democratic system. And so people aren't investing long term, and they're not investing in the right ways.
This managerial class thing and the sort of concomitant of consultants being paid a lot to go in and fix problems that they don't know how to fix has always confused me, because it's very easy to write angry editorials about those consultants on £1,000, £1.50 a day. But equally, isn't it the case that it's such a big, complicated, unwieldy, frequently reformed organisation that it does take sometimes outsiders to see what's wrong?
You mean management consultants rather than consultant surgeons?
I do. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes.
Your McKinsey types.
Sometimes, but I think the balance has gone too far to one extreme, and so there probably needs to be a bit more work on that equilibrium. And I also think there's scope here for inventive thinking. I mean, it's not just conventional taxation. Is there a way that we could have a voluntary philanthropic tax where we could choose to add a certain percentage to the amount of tax that we pay that will go specifically to the NHS? Because Kat is so right. The NHS is part of our beloved national identity. It's how, at its best, we want to see ourselves. And I think a lot of people, if they could, would want to pay a little bit extra if they knew that that's where it was going.
Quick show of hands for a voluntary tax at the NHS. Okay.
I mean, not hugely.
I'd say maybe that
Coming around with the cap
got
later.
a 7 or 8%.
We need to go on the campaign trail.
Stephen, you let the cat out the bag the other day that you're an occasional writer for the BMJ.
I am,
What do you
yes.
think about this?
Well, I think that part of the problem is that nobody genuinely understands that we don't really have an NHS. What we have is a series of small regional companies, all of which are branded NHS. Part of the reason that we have all this duplication of consultancy and duplication of management is that all the NHS trusts have their own management boards, their own set of consultants. They're all solving problems side by side without talking to each other. So they will all set about trying to understand how they're going to change their databases, and they won't have to register, they won't have to compare that with any other trust. So there'll be what there is a series of independent decisions made all across the country that don't speak to each other. And so each problem is being solved separately and no one's learning from each other. Everything is duplicated, well, not duplicated, whatever the number for lots and lots is. Even the NHS England itself doesn't provide legally any primary care. That's all done at the trust level. So there's all these little messages going all over the place. There isn't a coherent strategy. There isn't a coherent delivery of care.
But isn't the bigger issue the sort of changing demographics and we have to accept that as a nation we are not particularly healthy. We have very high obesity rates. We are quite sedentary. And we are getting older. And I feel like that is the kind of bigger problem that will force the issue, because, kind of layers of management can be stripped out. They kind of always do these efficiency rounds whenever there's a kind of, new pay settlement kind of, and they kind of strip some more managers out. And then you get to a point where there aren't enough managers, so then they have to bring outsiders in, costs more and so on. But I do wonder whether the trigger point on how we fall back in love with the NHS has to be reforming it to make it fit for purpose.
To solve these problems. What we have is a lot of very, very smart, very sharp doctors who are very good on tech, for instance, and yet what we do is we outsource the tech to an American private military company, and there's no need to do that. We can do that ourselves because there's great people working there. So you can trust the people who do it. But also there's the fundamental problem we have. I mean, when I had children, I took out private medical insurance because I wanted to jump the queue. There comes a point in your life where private medical insurance no longer wants to insure you. And that's the point that we are at with the population. The only way it works is if the younger people pay in to support the older people, because there's no money. It doesn't work if you're having older people pay for their own care. It's so impossible to make those sums add up. I reached the point about 5 years ago where it was impossible for me to cover the cost of my own private health insurance. I didn't want to anyway. I never used it, but that's our country. We've reached the point where we can't afford it. We have to rely on the fact that there are young people who are not being treated and are paying.
A final question for you before we move on. Has Labour got good plans? I took a quick look at what passes for the sort of proto-manifesto, and they had a great big list of problems that they would solve, but in almost every case they didn't say how. They did, however, say neighbourhood health service in place of national health service, which seemed to mean it's OK, we're going to put some MRI machines in your local clinic.
I think that's slightly unfair. But not. There are problems with what Labour is suggesting. So I think what they are getting at is the sort of prevention is better than cure approach. And instead of having the expectation that you wait until things are very bad and then you go to hospital, which costs a lot more money, that there would be efforts made within the community to make sure that people are healthy or to see people before they get to an acute phase. But that requires a slight rewiring of things. It doesn't necessarily require an awful lot of expenditure. The things that do require a lot of expenditure are the commitments to cutting waiting times by paying staff overtime and scheduling an extra 2 million operations and appointments in the first year, and pledging an extra 700,000 dentist appointments each year. These were both going to be funded by the plan to close the non-dom tax loophole, which the Tories have nicked.
I don't know. OK, just hold on there. I don't understand. Just the fact that doesn't mean that Labour can't use the same policy
no, but
to
it's
fund
been nicked to pay for other things. So either they would have to...
Oh, I see. They've actually nicked the money.
They've nicked the money.
I thought they just nicked the policy.
Well, but the reason for the policy is to raise money.
Oh, OK.
So that's several billion that they would have to suddenly find again. And it's interesting because when Labour came up with that original plan, there was lots of stories saying, oh, it will only raise $1 billion, or it might even cost the Exchequer because you'd have all of these wonderful people suddenly moving away. And then all of a sudden, when it's the Tory version, it's something like 6 or 7 billion it's going to raise. So amazing what the magic money tree can find.
We're going to move on, but thank you for solving that for me. Elizabeth, what's your story?
My story is about the mainstreamification of conspiracy theories. So we started this news meeting with footage of that appalling incident in Baltimore where a container ship collapsed a big bridge. And no sooner was that tragedy being reported around the world than Andrew Tate, an online influencer with 9 million followers on X, who has been indicted on human trafficking and rape charges in Romania, claimed without evidence that the ship had been cyber-attacked in a post that was then viewed 13.4 million times. Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist, then retweeted that and claimed that it was also a cyber-attack and World War III had started. We're obviously coming off the back of a frenzy of conspiracy theories around the Princess of Wales's alleged disappearance. And now that she's come out and said that she's being treated for cancer, there are more conspiracy theories about that video being an AI-generated deep fake. And I think that the reason conspiracy theories are reaching this tipping point is because there's a perfect storm of cultural influences. Of course, conspiracy theories are fueled by social media platforms and their gamification. So that idea that if you get higher engagement rates, that's part of the game, and it rewards you with more attention and ultimately more money. So you leap on the thing that is gaining most traction. There's also our obsession with true crime. I mean, as Tortoise knows, as the purveyors of excellent podcasts, we're all fascinated with true crime, with trying to understand a mystery, trying to come up with a reason for it, because we live in increasingly chaotic times. And I think the third element is our mistrust of institutions, which is at an all-time high. Now, there's a very serious implication for this, because conspiracy theorists are not just entertaining moments spent on TikTok when you're on the toilet, sort of scrolling through mindlessly. It also has severe implications for politics. In a year when we're having so many elections, we really need to question the things that we're being told, what we don't know about what we don't know. I mean, if you look at Donald Trump and how he has talked about elections being stolen from him, that's the ultimate conspiracy theory in many ways. And I think that there's something very interesting here about how conspiracy theories are used to advance pre-existing agendas. So if you have a mistrust of the COVID vaccine, then the Princess of Wales has cancer because she got vaccinated. If you have a mistrust of China, then it was China who was behind the alleged cyber attack that collapsed that bridge, which is going to affect our supply chains. Naomi Klein wrote a book called Doppelganger, which has actually just been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. And she has a great phrase for this, the coalition of the far right and the far out. So I think that we are at a really crucial tipping point for our culture and our politics, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I think that, therefore, you should write this piece about deep fakes to deep stakes. I fluffed your line, Kat. Deep fakes to deep stakes.
But is it a news story or is it a feature with a very convenient peg? A very spectacular peg, I might say.
Well, Giles, what's the difference?
Well, one leads the news and one doesn't.
But I think we live in a culture where actually we should be championing the long-form, slow news ideals, because in the form, that in itself is the antithesis of a TikTok conspiracy theory. So actually you're encouraging people to cogitate, to think, to digest, to invest in a long read that is looking at something that is becoming increasingly urgent.
Mm-hmm. OK, I do want to get onto the boat and the bridge in just a second, but do you have a solution? In a nutshell solution to the conflation of the far right and the far out? Apart from long reads and slow newscasts on Tortoise.
I hope that the children are our future. Like, and I actually hope that the growing mistrust of social media and constant communication amongst Gen Zers and the one after that, what are they called?
Alphas.
Alphas, Gen A, Gen Alpha. I've noticed, I've got 3 teenage stepchildren, and I've noticed that they don't want to be in touch all the time with people that they don't know over the internet. They actually value smaller groups of friends, and they value more real life interactions. And so I hope that maybe by writing these stories and encouraging people to engage with the issues, then that will have a knock-on effect. But no, I don't have a solution. Come on. I'm just here to point out the problems, not solve them.
Fair enough. Power without responsibility, that is our profession. But just about the boat, I'm really in the market for theories here, whether conspiratorial or not, because how on earth can a gigantic container ship lose all power as it heads toward a bridge? And if it's not sinister, then why doesn't it happen more often? Go on then, Steve.
I have read, in prepping for this, I read a very, very detailed account, and I ought to credit the source. It's news.com.au, which has gone like a minute-by-minute account of what happened. And it points out that it couldn't be hacked because the systems that would be hacked, the onboard sort of computers, they don't connect to the drive mechanism of the ship. They're the computers that we all have, the laptops for emailing and stuff. So you couldn't hack into a ship from the outside and take control of its mechanics. The only way you do that, we
know that because news.com.au tells us.
I read it in 2 separate. I can't remember the second one, unfortunately.
Double sourced. Well done, Stephen.
But they aren't connected systems. So the only way you could do it is if you got onto the boat. You'd have to be on the boat to change to do that. And there is the thing about conspiracy theories is they're so enticing. I think that's the problem. So when you read the conspiracy theory, they say, well, where were the harbour pilots? Where were the tugs? And then when you read that, well, the tugs had just let the ship go. There were 2 harbour pilots on the bridge, and it was the harbour pilots who were suggesting that the ship throw an anchor into the water, which changed the direction of the ship, which made it round the bridge as opposed to veering down the channel. So all these things make perfect sense in certain respects. The ship did have mechanical problems earlier on. There were problems with so there's lots of, it's boring, but there are really tedious details as to how it could have happened. Part of the problem was once the electrics went out, there was no way they could pump air into the diesel engine, which would have switched on and da-da-da-da-da. So it does, I can show you the page, but it's very... Amazing. You'd tune out halfway down, I think.
Kat, let's come back to the part of this that Elizabeth was actually really pitching, the mainstreamification of misinformation, right? What was the actual...
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories. Yeah. Is that a big deal, and is this a good peg?
Well, I think that Elizabeth's actual peg is the elections year element, and the fact that this is, if you can't trust what you read and you can't trust what you see, that is quite destabilising at any time, particularly when you're going to the polls. I noticed in the last few days that there is some more information that has come out about the deep fake about Keir Starmer, which I have mentioned a few times on this news meeting, about when a deep fake was released during a Labour Party conference, which was purporting to be him initially shouting at a staffer and then secondarily complaining about how awful Liverpool was whilst the conference was in Liverpool. Neither of them were real. But lots and lots of people heard them, and what has come out subsequently is that Labour was making a lot of efforts to get these removed, and I think it was Twitter or possibly Meta or possibly both resisted until well after they were seen by millions of people, and that is the issue, I think. If you have people like Elon Musk in charge of Twitter, and we know that he has a particular worldview and not necessarily one that is shared by most sentient beings, that is an issue when you're in charge of media that millions, if not billions, of people are able to access at any given time. And so I think the question is, when you're asking what's the solution, well, again, we kind of hear a lot about how wonderful AI is, and we know that it's possible for them to turn off certain kinds of content at certain points because they are forced to, and yet they don't seem to be particularly willing to do certain things on, things that encourage kids to self-harm or kind of misinformation, disinformation. So I actually think that what needs to happen is, we have better, more tech literate people in our government able to really take on the social media companies and say, well, hang on a minute, actually you can do that and this is how you do it. Why aren't you doing it? Oh, it's because you get a lot of advertising revenues around it. Is that why? I think that's where some of this, I'm not saying all of it, because of course I totally agree with Elizabeth. I think we as a species have an innate need to see patterns and create stories to tell us a sort of comforting story that we're not sort of, kind of living in a sort of accidental world where we don't have any control. And that's where I think most conspiracy theories come out of.
Yeah.
So I think we are sort of fighting our innate urges.
I totally agree, and I think that there are interesting parallels with the golden age of detective fiction, which obviously happened in the 1920s and 1930s as a corrective to the chaos of the Great War and the confusion that we went through. And we haven't been through that, but we have been through a massive pandemic, and we're seeking once again to make sense of a world that feels very frightening a lot of the time.
And Arthur Conan Doyle, obviously a renowned lover of seances.
I know, it's all connected. The other reason you should have this as your lead, Giles, is because you can have a picture of Taylor Swift. And I know illustrations are important because Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce were at the subject of another conspiracy theory where they had rigged the result of the Super Bowl because, as you'll know, Travis Kelce plays for the Kansas Chiefs and they won the Super Bowl this year. In a year when Taylor Swift is arguably the most globally successful woman, raking in billions from her Eras tour. And there was a whole conspiracy around the fact that that was happening because she's a Biden plant and she was going to announce her endorsement for Biden during the Super Bowl ad break.
I'm very grateful for the tip, and I'm sure you're right that a picture of Swift would sell or get eyeballs. I want a picture of the bridge because I think it's.
Oh, Giles.
I know. My real job title is popular mechanics correspondent. Just briefly, can you pick up on the point that Kat made that your peg is really that this is election year? Where does your faith in human nature come to rest now? Are you reasonably confident that in the privacy of the ballot of the voting booth, most people will be able to sort the nonsense from the sense?
I'm actually not. No.
Shake of the.
No.
This is audio. Shake of the head from Kat.
Yes, Kat's shaking her head, and thank you for clarifying my pitch, Kat. But that's exactly what I intended to say. No, I don't have faith, sadly, because I think a lot of people are living through a really difficult, challenging time and a cost of living crisis, and they don't have enough time to devote to understanding whether what they're being told is real or fake. That's a lot of pressure on an individual. But having said that, more broadly speaking, I remain unfashionably optimistic about the future of humanity, in the sense that I do think the thing that still distinguishes us from AI is our capacity for empathy and compassion and connection. And I think part of the solution, again, is leaning into that and teaching our future generations of robots how to be kind and nice. And that starts with being polite to your Siris and your Alexas and saying thank you very much.
I was mocked for saying please.
Yet I'm mocked constantly by my husband for it, but that's how they're learning. We need to model good parenting.
That's great. That's empathy, compassion, connection. I think we need to compile a tortoise list of things that AI can't do, to which I would...
We don't want to teach them that, because then we won't be able to distinguish them from us.
We're not going to teach them that. It's just lists of things that we can do and they can't.
We are doing.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to keep it out of their training.
There's a thing about the vaccine conspiracy theories, which I don't know if you saw this. There was a research project about 5 years ago in America where the government tried to intervene in anti-vaccine communities, and they did a variety of different interventions. They sort of squared it off and tried to work out which would work best. And they found that no intervention worked at all. It was just some of them made people more anti-vaccine and some of them left them at the same level of anti-vaccine that they were. Wow. The only thing that had any effect was to give people a self-esteem raising session, because after their self-esteem was raised, they were more prepared to receive new information that contradicted their stated view, because their identity was so bound up in their views. And I think we are in a world which probably has still to get over the 2006-2007 crash. We're still dealing with, as Kat was talking about, with the effects of austerity, with the kind of world. And I think there's a sense in which we're all just kind of broken, and it's easier to believe nonsense than to try and believe in ourselves in a way.
That's fascinating. There's self-esteem is tied into our ability to take in new stuff.
Yeah, there's lots of really interesting studies on sort of polarisation and kind of how to persuade people. And I think Steve's absolutely right that basically if you attempt to persuade people in a sort of overt way, then people get their backs up. If you try to tell someone you voted for the wrong person, then obviously you're going to think, bloody hell, I voted for the right person, I'm going to vote for them again. But one of the things that I really kind of think about, probably more often than is healthy, is this idea that in order to try to sell the idea of litter being bad, which, I mean, obviously seems quite self-evident, there were different ways of doing it. So for some groups, you emphasise the environmental thing. For some groups, you emphasise the sort of local neighbourhood, almost like a patriotism type thing. And so there's lots of different ways that you can do it, that you just need to kind of understand what are the world views, what are the values that the person is holding, and that's the way to, I mean, frankly, manipulate them.
Empathetically.
But yeah, to understand what it is that motivates someone, and that's how you get them to kind of, see the world as you would like them to see.
We'll get you to come back and do the whole litter thing with reference to Margaret Thatcher. She just went out and picked it up, right? Or, am I remembering the right Prime Minister? She used to go and pick up litter. Anyway.
Sounds like a Thatcher-like thing to do.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for your story. We're going to take a break now, and then we'll hear what Stephen thinks should lead the news. Insert advert. OK, Stephen, let's hear about your story.
Well, my story follows on quite neatly from Elizabeth's, in that it's about Truth Social and Trump's Bibles. So on Tuesday, Trump Media merged with a special purpose acquisition company called DWAC and became DJT, Donald J. Trump. It is the effective sneaky IPO of Truth Social. It's not a real IPO because the
initial public offering.
Yes, which Silicon Valley uses to raise billions of dollars. In this case, they didn't really. What they did is they snuck into another company that had already been listed and then just changed its name. That's partly because banks didn't really want to handle the Donald Trump flirtation. The shares were valued at $50 and they soared. The company is now trading round about $67, $68 a share, which is valuing the company at about $8-9 billion. And Donald Trump owns 58% of the shares, which gives him a sweet $4.5 to $5 billion which will help, in theory, with his enormous debts and massive legal problems. In practice, it won't. He can't sell the shares for 6 months. He also shouldn't borrow money against the shares for 6 months under the terms of the way that these things normally happen. The only way he could do it is if the board of the company were to do him a special favour and say, yes, you can use this as cash, or maybe you can take...
And they're all super fans.
Yeah,
so if
they
anyone's
probably
going to
will.
do him a favour...
They probably will, you know, but it'll take a bit of time. He is in a pickle. He has to pay this... technical term there. He has to pay this 500 million odd in terms of bonds, or had to, in order to appeal his rulings in a New York City fraud case and in the defamation case against a woman who had accused him of rape. He couldn't raise the money. He couldn't find a way to cover the bond because all of his assets are in buildings. He doesn't really have the cash that he says he's got. No one would lend him the money. In the end, he had to, on the same day as Truth Social floated, he had to go to a judge and essentially beg, could you lower the amount of money I've got to put in? And the judge did him a solid and took it down to just under 200 million, which he rather cockily said, I'm going to pay in cash, which is not true, Donald, you can't. And so this is part of his get out of jail. The other get out of jail is he's marketing Bibles for Easter at $60 a pop. Because, as who remembers, bless his heart, there was a time when he marched out of the White House and went and stood next to a church and held a Bible up to make some political point somewhere, and he held the Bible upside down. So obviously it's not a... And I was like, he's not been to church. Although the evangelicals still support him fanatically. It's very... And the trouble is, Trump is... You could pitch this story any day of the week. There would always be something like this going on every single day.
Undermining your own pitch.
Yeah, I know. I just suddenly reached the idea that every time I think of something,
this is a very specific. This is a very specific pitch, and there's a specific question I have about it, which is, although it seems flimsy, this 8 to 9 billion valuation, if all the investors are true believers, is that not the solidest sort of the financial underpinning for a company that you can have? They're not going to sell.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. So, typically in a situation like this, what you'd find is in the early days of trading, you'd find institutional investors coming into what they thought was a solid stock and buying up large chunks as an investment. In this case, what you're finding is what they call retail investors are doing the big purchasing, and those are people who are doing their own investing. And it would certainly seem from the evidence that we have that they're all Trump fanatics. All the chat on Reddit and Rumble and Truth Social are people who are buying it in order to support Trump and go MAGA. What the hedge funds are doing is they are shorting the stock. They think this is a massively overvalued stock, partly because it's got, at best, 5 million users per month, and that is falling. It users are,
and very low revenues as well.
It made 3 million against losses of about 50 million. So they are of the opinion this is not a sustainable business plan. Now, what you're seeing is the number of stocks which are held by short sellers are creeping up. Typically, for a company, there's going to be probably 3 to 4% of the shares will be owned by short sellers who are waiting for the company to crash. In the case of Truth Social, after 2 days of trading, it's already over 12% of the shares are held by short sellers, and it's creeping up. So you're going to get to the point where, as the short sellers start to buy up this great opportunity because they think they're going to be able to sell and make a huge ton of cash, it starts to inflict on the stocks available for true believers.
Elizabeth, what do you make of this story?
I'm fascinated by the Bibles. Do they have his insignia on? Do they have his
they've got a phrase. I should have researched the phrase on it, but there's only a certain amount of reading on this you can do before you start to feel slap dirty. But yeah, they've got some message, probably America Great Again in there somewhere. And it's...
I think what's extraordinary about Donald Trump, one of many things, is the power that familiarity holds over an electorate. The fact that he was beamed into sitting rooms across the USA as the presenter of The Apprentice for many, many years, and he became this cultural figure who made cameo appearances in movies. He became the sort of crazy uncle at the wedding who you're used to. You sort of understand that he's going to be crazy and he's going to do some mad dancing and you don't want to get stuck in a room with him, but you sort of accept him because he's just part of the family. And the fact that he's been able to take that power and become now the former president of the United States and possibly again, and holds this great sway and currency is terrifying and riveting, and really speaks to the impact that reality television, I think, has on our culture at large. I mean, we live in a world where Kim Kardashian, off the back of a sex tape, has built a multi-billion-dollar family industry and has trained as a lawyer and is freeing people from death row. I mean, it's extraordinary. Whatever you think of the Kardashians, they are shaping our world. And I think that's the thing that interests me about Trump, partly because I can't understand hedge funds.
Are you managing to adjust to the idea of Trump 2.0?
No, not really. And I feel lucky that I don't live in America. I have a lot of good friends who live in California, which one might argue, particularly LA, isn't part of America, but they are having a really difficult time. And actually,
I wonder if they might actually secede in the event of Trump 2.0.
I wouldn't put it past them. And actually, talking of friendship, a lot of my friends in LA have lost friendships because the political landscape in America is so binary, and they've had to end friendships because their friends have become rabid anti-vaxxers or pro-Trumpers, and that's something that they just can't stretch to accommodate with their worldview.
Kat, Trump Social, your story? What kind of story?
Yeah, I'm also quite drawn to the Bible element because it makes me immediately think of the time that Michael Gove put a forward in some Bibles and sent them out for free to all the schools when he was Education Secretary.
What?
But
totally passed me by.
That did not, it seems, springboard him into the Prime Ministership of the UK. I can't think why. It does tell you, I think, a lot about our country being very different to their country, but also, I think, maybe Michael Gove is quite a different politician to Donald Trump. But the hedge fund element, although I don't necessarily understand all the technicalities of it, I think is the sort of delicious element of it, because it seems to me like this could be a really foolhardy thing that he's done. It could backfire tremendously, and he could have a massive company failure on his hands in the run-up to an election, which... I know he styles a lot of things out, and God knows he's styled out worse than a big company fallout, but that's not good. And I'm not sure about the rules about standing for presidency and so on. You're not allowed to be an MP if you're bankrupt, but...
Yeah, in America, I mean, the thing about being president is you're immune from everything. So that's, I mean, part of his...
That is being tested right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and so whilst he's president, assuming they vote for him, then...
But if it happens before?
I mean, the rules of who's allowed to stand for president don't include whether they've been a bankrupt or not. It's largely about where you're born and what your age is.
OK. It might take some of the wind out of his sail.
Yeah. But I think his belief, and I also think, this is to harp on again about self-esteem, I think a lot of the things that we're talking about is ideas arriving to meet a need. I mean, Donald Trump's avuncular passion, I guess.
Not like an uncle I know.
Well, it's one of mine. It sort of matches this need that particular parts of America had for the sense that their country was spiralling out of control. Now, whether that's real or not, it came from somewhere. I think you can't invent a meme of this kind of messaging and just stick it onto a country that's not ready for it. People were ready for him, and they were ready for someone to do that. And I think that's in a way the problems America has are not going to be solved by Donald Trump, but the fact that he is potentially president indicates an enormous problem. And I think that's true of large parts of the West. There's a big thing by Nate Cohn recently about the realignment in America, which is all of the previously accepted political norms are disappearing, and the allegiances that previously existed no longer exist. So you're having to rethink all the assumptions you make about American politics because it has changed for good.
Thank you. So those are the stories. Trump and Truth Social, falling out of love with the NHS, and The Bridge and the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories. In a bit, I'm playing for time here so that I can think. I will make a decision about which one will lead the news, but before I do, you guys have to choose. You are allowed to choose one story, but it can't be your own. Who should we start with? Kat?
I'm going to choose Elizabeth's story because I do think it is fascinating, and I think I actually wasn't aware of the Andrew Tate element because I live in a joyful world that I do not follow him. But I think it's clear that there is this issue around successful influencers who are there sort of deliberately sort of stirring the pot and putting out disinformation is not being tackled properly, and that should worry all of us in this year of all years. So I'm going with Elizabeth.
OK, Elizabeth, which one?
Thank you, Kat. I think you're great. But
Alas, fine. It's a brutal game.
I'm slightly depressed by the NHS, and therefore I want to read about something that carries within it the potential to have an illustration of a Bible with Donald Trump's face on it. And I think that Stephen's story is a really great way into lots of different tentacles, including my own, actually. So I'm going with Stephen's story.
OK, Stephen.
Well, I am not because we're, voting for the guest, but I'm going to go for Elizabeth's as well. I mean, not least because it is the best picture, without doubt. To lead their story with the bridge collapse. Also, until...
Yeah, but she wants to illustrate as a Taylor Swift.
Both, you can have both. Both guys.
well, yeah, OK, fair enough. I can
An
see.
AI of Taylor standing on the bridge.
Yeah.
See,
It's because
the political
collapsed.
the political realignment on stage is happening. But I think that when someone said we're going to be doing the Baltimore Bridge because of the conspiracy theories, some part of me went, what? And I think that's what I responded to. This idea of how.
At Tortoise, well, distinctions, I should say. One is between spinach and cheesecake. A lot of people don't like the distinction, but the cheesecake is the easily accessible, feel slightly guilty afterwards story. The spinach is the one that you know that you have to get into and absorb and benefit from in the long term. The other more recent distinction that we have is between netball and football, isn't it? And that is a story that a netball story is one that doesn't travel beyond these shores, and a football one does. Yep. I am going to put at the top of the news the fate of the NHS, and that might surprise Kat, but here is an experiment that is well known throughout the world in socialised medicine. A lot of people outside the UK are interested in the fate of the NHS, and it is in a pickle. The funding model is bust, its users are dissatisfied, both main parties agree that it needs fundamental reform and they don't know how to do it. A lot of people are watching because, or not least because, rival systems aren't that great either, particularly in the US. I think it's a fascinating debate, and we will see soon enough what Labour has to add to it. That's going to lead the news. Doesn't mean that I'm not absolutely fascinated by the other two stories. Elizabeth, I mean, thank you so much for giving us an excuse to discuss the bridge. Just in terms of kind of pitching, what happened here was that you came with the bridge and the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories, and we ended up with Taylor Swift and the election as your peg. All of it could fill, the front 6 pages of a newspaper, but in the end, I was too confused to put it at the top of the list, and I'm sorry to say that. And
I'm not sorry at all, because I'm going to take that red-hot news story elsewhere and make hundreds of pounds from it.
Which one's the red-hot one?
Just because you're confused, Giles, that's your issue, not mine.
Actually, no, we may well find before the night is out that someone did hack the boat, and Stephen was wrong that it was impossible. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Trump and Truth Social, it's going to lead the news for the rest of the next 6 months, so not tonight. I'll have plenty of time.
Although we are doing it tomorrow.
Yeah, we do. Look out for your Tortoise SenseMaker email, right? It's all there. We're making sense of it there. So that's how I run the stories. Remember, you can... What, am I not allowed to give that away? I am, aren't I? Yeah. Remember, you
Somewhat
can.
undermines your current position, but that's
Funnily enough, I did not decide what leads the news.
It's a
in the Sense
conspiracy.
Maker tomorrow because
I'm not.
other things.
I'm happy. I'm taking the win.
Bank that. Remember, you can email us about the stories that we've missed. Just send your thoughts to newsmeeting@tortoisemedia.com. But as we're in front of a live audience, let's find out what people in the newsroom think. Oh my goodness. Let's start. The first hand was a gentleman with the blue zipped.
Yeah, thank you. John Tidy. I'm a Tortoise Media supporter, subscriber. Well done, Kat. You did a brilliant job there. Fantastic.
Thank you.
For being accused of being your chief, fan. You did. It is the right one, and well done, John.
Thank you.
You finally caught up, dear.
Just one point. If anyone's aware of the organisation Every Doctor,
Yes.
the thing that you talked about, I think, maybe didn't talk about actually, is the amount of money that is going into the NHS that is then being funneled out through private sector contracts. And put my hand up here, I'm not a Tory supporter at all. It's my contention, and I'm not alone, that it's actually a conscious decision of this government of using not just the NHS but other public sector channels to basically get money into the private sector, and that private sector is very generally supporter financially of the Tory party.
We should follow the funds.
Well, I mean, I think the NHS is a very complicated topic, and I think there are a lot of outside companies that probably are doing good work for the NHS. But there is, the last couple of weeks, the story about Frank Hester, the donor that made racist comments, is one of those beneficiaries. So there are definitely, and I think COVID, the kind of COVID contracts issue definitely kind of put that into the spotlight. But yeah, that it's a complicated topic.
One more here at the front, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you, Paul Atherton. I think one of the most interesting stories that's happened in the last 24 hours is the Office of National Statistics reversal of their decision to stop publishing people who died whilst homeless statistics. Not least because it seems to not be because of anything mathematical or statistical, but purely from political pressure from various homelessness organisations to say continuing, because ultimately they decided not to continue publishing them because the stats weren't robust, and they haven't changed anything to make those statistics more robust. They simply feel that, seemingly from what they were saying yesterday, is that actually the people have come forward and said we want to keep publishing these, but it's a question of then what the Office of National Statistics are for, and if their statistics are no longer robust, whether they have any validity.
That's a good question.
When it comes to homelessness, there are multiple kind of issues around accuracy that are particular to that sector, and I know there are other organisations like the Museum of Homelessness that do kind of keep on top of it. I wouldn't necessarily say that decision was one that would undermine the rigour of the ONS more generally, but it's definitely worth looking at in terms of the sort of deprioritisation of homelessness, which I think during COVID in particular there was this kind of brief period in which people were suddenly much more conscious of and much more kind of well disposed towards people living on the streets. I think that unfortunately seems to have been a short-lived thing, we've done some work with the Museum of Homelessness before, so that's something we should probably look at.
Okay, I'm being told from stage right that we need to move on.
Apologies. I'm curious about the book, and I had time.
So we should not let the moment pass. Elizabeth, your book is Friendaholic: Confessions of a Friendship Addict, and it's a lovely book. And as I started by saying, I'm a curmudgeon, a sort of no friends curmudgeon. I thought, nah, not for me. And then I got into it, and it's very moving. in parts, in the middle.
In parts. Thank you. That's very kind of you.
You talk very frankly, as you have on your podcast, about, I think we're allowed to call it, your fertility journey. I'm not sure if that's is an acceptable cliche.
Yes.
Yes. But you also have added some notes from the period since the hardback came out. And in one of them you say, wait a minute, that you regret the fact that we don't have more language on platonic friendships in order to speak more clearly about them, and no rituals to sort of formalise them. And maybe I'm paraphrasing you clumsily. I'm definitely paraphrasing you clumsily. But isn't that the whole point of friendship, that it is not codified? We don't have specific language for it. It's all messy and difficult and awkward, especially if we're British.
I don't think that's the point of it, but it might be a byproduct of the fact that as a society we have elevated romantic love above all other forms for so many centuries that we've almost overlooked friendship or taken it for granted. And yet, for so many of us, friendship, both its presence and sometimes sadly its absence, can really shape and define our lives. But the term itself, friendship, is so broad as to be rendered almost meaningless. Everyone in this room will have a vastly different experience and expectation of what friendship is. And sometimes that does lead to this toxic cauldron of confusion where you constantly feel that you're doing friendship wrong in some way, or you're constantly under the misapprehension that just because you sit next to someone at primary school, simply because your surnames start with the same letter, you must be friends forever and ever for the rest of your lives, or you have failed in some way. And I really wanted to investigate what friendship was, what the evolutionary reason for it is, to look at my own friendships and what they think of our friendship, and to try and come up with a unique vocabulary for what this dynamic means to all of us. And the idea of friendship rituals is simply that with romantic love, we're very practiced with that idea that we go through a process of dating, we go through a process of swiping right or left on Hinge. You might have the inordinately interminable banter that goes on for weeks on end, and then you might choose to have a date. That's a chemistry check. Second date, you might go for dinner. Third date, you might be talking about shared hopes and aspirations. And then if you choose to settle down together, there are a series of rituals you can go through to show to greater society at large and to each other what your relationship means to you. You can get married, you can have a civil partnership, you can buy a house together, well, you can do it with your friend as well. But with friendship, we don't have any of that. And what that sometimes means is that we rush headlong into friendship, where actually we're just being friendly, and suddenly we find ourselves in this committed friendship that actually neither party generally has capacity for. Or it means that we don't take the time to really understand what our friend wants from us and vice versa. And so my attempt in Friendaholic is to provide some of that lexicon.
And you say at one point that you felt real shame over ghosting someone.
No, they ghosted me. Yeah, and I felt shame because I thought
about having been ghosted?
Yes, because I thought I must have done something terribly wrong. And perhaps I did, but the thing is I'll never fully know, because when someone ghosts you, and this was someone I considered one of my 3 closest friends at the time, they just drop out of your life without any explanation. And therefore you put in your own narrative, and very often we tell ourselves the worst stories about ourselves. And so I did feel shame and guilt and embarrassment and humiliation and all of those things. And I also felt loss. I felt grief that this person who had been so important to me was no longer part of my life. And it took a very long time to work through. But I think the reason that we ghost in friendships is precisely because we don't have that language. So similarly, in romantic love, we do have a language of endings. We're used to saying, oh, it's not you, it's me, and I'm just not ready for commitment. But with friendships, we think of endings as somehow admissions of failure. And actually, I'm a huge advocate of the idea that friendships can be for a season in our lives rather than the whole lifetime, and that they can come back in our life in different phases and different decades, and we don't need to sort of cling on to them rigidly, making ourselves feel bad about ending them if they're not serving either party in the ways that we want.
So what's the telltale sign of sign of friendaholism?
Great question. So the way that I define friendaholism is a sort of codependent relationship with the notion of friendship. You get that sort of adrenalized buzz of connection when you meet someone's eyes and you forge a sort of kindred spirit type connection. But the issue for me, I mean, the root of my addiction comes from low self-esteem, being bullied at school, growing up in Northern Ireland with a very English accent, at the height of the Troubles, never feeling that I fitted in. And when I changed secondary schools, having been bullied at my school in Belfast, I became almost manic in my pursuit of friends because it represented safety to me. But I, in that manic rush, the only thing that was important to me was to work out what someone wanted from me as a friend and then provide it so that I could be accepted. It took me much longer to untangle the idea that true belonging is about being accepted for who you actually are. And in my rush to please others, I really undermined the fundamental meaning of friendship, which is that we do have this true acceptance of kindred spirits. And then that's when friendship is done well. And because I was run ragged trying to keep up all of these different friendships and connections, it meant that I was betraying my closest friends. I wasn't spending the time with them that I needed to in order to nurture those relationships.
What was your favourite rom-com?
Another brilliant question. My favourite rom-com is When Harry Met Sally, which is the best rom-com. And it's why there is a chapter in this book inspired by the fundamental question at the heart of When Harry Met Sally.
Well, that's the Satnam chapter, right?
It is the Satnam chapter, previously of the news meeting parish. Yes, so...
Go straight to the Satnam chapter.
Satnam Sanghera and I were set up on a date, a romantic date, and we very rapidly established that there was no sexual chemistry between us.
Wait,
we're missing... offended when I say this. He says it gets quicker and quicker each time. Sorry, what were you about to say?
No, I don't want to spoil it. Go ahead.
So we were set up on a date, but we established that we were better friends. And he's one of the most important friends in my life. And I wanted to speak to him about the When Harry Met Sally conundrum. Can straight men and straight women ever truly be friends? And my spoiler alert conclusion is we absolutely can, as long as at some level the sex part, the idea of romance has been dealt with. So either you've dealt with it because you've gone on an unsuccessful date, or I think you can be friends with a non-serious ex because you've tried it and it failed, or they're married, or they're gay, and therefore it just never comes up. But I have really sustaining friendships with all genders. So yes, that's what inspired that chapter.
Okay. Well, look, if there's anyone with a burning question that has to be public, raise your hand and ask it now. Otherwise, I think Elizabeth's going to stick around and sign some books, and you can probably get into mutual confessionals there. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Cat and Stephen, thank you very much. And that's it for this episode of the News Meeting. We'll be back on Monday. Until then, have a lovely weekend.